This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is your show for October 25th, 2016, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
And producer Pat.
Hi, everybody.
Unfortunately, Christina couldn't be with us. She's having an out-of-body experience somewhere else. Different plane, I assume. But we have a great show for you today. Pat is going to talk to us about fake academic papers. And Adam is going to explore plain packaging on cigarettes.
Indeed.
But first, I'm going to talk to you about the U.S. election and polls. Perhaps you maybe, kinda, sorta, might be aware that there's a U.S. presidential election going on this year. Not just the president, of course, but also various seats in the Senate and the House are up for re-election. And with election comes polls. Now, people really want to know the future, and instead of psychics, reasonable people look to polling data. Don't they?
Yeah.
Well, somewhat. We know polls aren't perfect. It depends on who conducts them, the questions being asked, who is asked, and how many people are asked. Obviously, the future is uncertain, and it hasn't happened yet, thus it being the future. But surely you can reduce the uncertainty of this future by taking those things into account when you're thinking about polls. And that seems to be sort of true. But let's explore this a bit. My inspiration and source for this segment is a piece in the New York Times called, "When you hear the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, think 7 instead."
Oh.
Pretty indicative headline, by David Rothschild and Sherrod Goel. And that article is linked on our show at trcpodcast.com.
It's
a great website.
If you survey 1,000 people, that comes with a 3% margin of error, meaning there's a 95% chance that the survey estimate should be within 3 percentage points of the true answer.
Mm-hmm.
This is because the margin of error depends inversely on the square root of the sample size. A sample size of 100 will give you a 10% margin of error. So if 60% of people currently support Hillary Clinton, the estimate from the survey could be 63% or 57%, but it's unlikely to be 70%.
But basically you just sample more people and shrink those error bars?
You'd think so, but not quite.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that true, Darren? I think that the larger the sample size, the smaller the error rate, correct?
Correct, of this certain type of error. And that's part of what the segment's about. Yes, if you sample 4,000 people, then you get a 1.5% margin of error. But because the fluctuation in the actual values changes more than that 1.5% day to day, sometimes in a political election, it's usually not worth the money to go beyond about 1,000 people. Mm-hmm. That's sort of how they settle upon that. Of course, all this is that 95% part of the survey. If you happen to change that, then that would change what a margin of error is. But because it's been common practice, 95% likelihood of it being true, that's why it's a 3% margin of error for 1,000 people you survey.
So basically, if they only counted 4,000 votes, close enough.
Something like that. But that doesn't seem to match reality. And here's a quote from Rothschild and Goel. In a new paper with Andrew Gelman and Houshmand Sharani-Meher, we examined 4,221 late campaign polls, every public poll they could find, for 608 state-level presidential, Senate, and governor's races between 1998 and 2014. Comparing these polls results with actual electoral results, we find the historical margin of error is plus or minus 6 to 7 percentage points.
Huh.
Yes, that's an error range of 12 to 14 points, not the typically reported 6 or 7. So that means even a 12% difference in polling numbers doesn't mean the leader would win. Now, of course, there was always this chance, given that 95% confidence I said, but here, even the likelihood is decent for such a thing to occur, given the normal structure.
Yeah.
So why is there such a big error range, according to real-world data? Rothschild and Goel explain. Starting with a stated margin of error, which is usually 3%, that captures sampling variation. This error exists because you're only surveying a sample of people, a subset of a population, and that's what a sample is. Even if randomly surveyed, it is not a perfect depiction of the population. That's just how it goes. Mm-hmm. But there are other errors, such as frame error and non-response error and analysis error.
Oh, yeah.
Frame error happens when the sample and target population don't match. The New York Times piece says, quote, "For example, for phone-based surveys, people without phones would never be included in any sample. Of particular importance for election surveys, the sampling frame includes many adults who are not likely to vote. Pollsters try to correct this by using likely voter screens, typically asking respondents if they will vote, but this screen itself can introduce error that can at times be larger than the bias it was intended to correct."
Sure.
Now, non-response seems pretty self-explanatory and can happen for various reasons, one of which is that supporters of the currently behind candidate are less likely to respond. But if your candidate is doing really well, you might also respond less.
Oh.
Some election surveys this year have non-response rates above 90%.
Wow.
Yeah. That might be a problem.
That's terrible.
So the idea being that the polls say it's a slam dunk, therefore my vote doesn't really count, therefore I don't need to go out.
Right. Either way, right?
Sure.
Slam dunk
Yeah.
win, slam dunk loss, maybe I'm less inclined. But this is maybe, right?
I guess there's also the idea that people feel like it's their civic duty leading up to the months and months and months of interest in the campaign, but then the actual evening of, well, there's something on TV I want to watch. And
Right, exactly. Or they could tell the person who's talking to them that they believe they should vote because it is a believed civic duty. So then you want to impress the person who's asking you the question, right? Now, Rothschild and Goel say that there are also errors in the analysis phase, and they cite Nate Cohen, who showed in an Upshot article, which is also linked on the website, that 4 pollsters arrived at different estimates even when they started from the same raw polling data.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now, it wasn't dramatic. One had Clinton +1, one had Clinton +3, one had Clinton +4, and another one had Trump +1. But that's enough, given that they all had the exact same data. They were working from the exact same survey with the exact same results.
Even if the results aren't dramatic, if the outcome is different, that's kind of all people will pay attention to.
Right, so that's a +1 Trump to +4 Hillary sizable difference,
Yeah.
and they all had the same data. The article tries to communicate that they don't believe any of the pollsters did anything problematic. It's just that how they might have categorized voters into the likely voter camp or used demographic breakdowns to then indicate what the likelihood of them voting were might be slightly different.
right.
But they actually describe exactly how they did it so you can understand why. So it's a useful article.
As long as they lay out their methodology prior to analyzing the data rather than sort of fitting their methodology to map to go with the results that they want and then sort of doing it a little backwards, that's when it gets sketchy, right? You're data mining at that point.
Well, right. That's a very good point. And in this particular case, I believe it was done for the article itself, so everyone knew what they were doing. I don't know if they shared it ahead of time, but they certainly shared the methodology. But as we know, there are many people who conduct polls who have a biased interest, perhaps, and then would design questions a certain way so they don't have to do anything finicky with the data.
Yeah.
They just get the things you want because of the questions you asked. Now, Rothschild and Goel think the other errors about wording and bias that I mentioned before are actually less important in this particular U.S. election surveys. Also, it seems polls tend to consistently over or underestimate the situation. They don't average out, though. Because I was thinking, okay, so some polls will overestimate one person's chance and the other person's underestimate the other chance. So then it kind of works, doesn't it? But no, not quite. It seems that they all move in a herd of sorts, even though they're operating independently.
Okay.
And this could be because pollsters are making similar assumptions about who will vote, or non-response bias is consistently one way versus the other. As they state in the Times piece, Rothschild and Goel say, we can measure this error after the fact, but during the campaign it's hard to identify which candidate has the inflated lead. We do not observe any systematic bias in favor of Democratic or Republican candidates. This makes sense. If we saw this, pollsters would correct for it.
Yeah.
So we're just going to have to wait until after the election to find out how accurate our current polls are.
And that's almost useless.
I think polling we just see as a fact of life, and especially with our current communications, we think it can be instantaneous, and we want to kind of know the future before it happens. Even the debates, which were very impactful, of course, on how people felt, Nate Silver at 538 kept saying it's going to take 4 to 7 days for the effects of the debate itself to reflect in the polling. So we learned that real polls can be problematic. Of course, fake polls will be even worse. And fake academic papers? That's just terrible. Isn't that right, Pat?
Some listeners may remember a segment that Christina did back in August about people sharing articles that they didn't actually read based solely on the headlines. To illustrate the point, she talked about an article published by satirical site The Science Post titled, Study. 70% of Facebook users only read the headline of a science story before commenting. That article had been shared 46,000 times when she did the segment. The punchline was that it was made up almost entirely of lorem ipsum. This is text commonly used as a placeholder in publishing and graphic design, and it has no meaning whatsoever. So that's us common folk, but such a thing would never happen in the world of academia, right? Well, you may have heard of a paper originally written by American researchers David Mazarias and Eddie Cole titled, Get Me Off Your Effing Mailing List.
I have.
The paper consisted of the title's 7 words repeated over and over again. It also featured hilarious diagrams which contained those 7 words.
Huh.
In 2005, the two scientists submitted the paper to the 9th World Multi-Conference on Systemics, Cybernetics, and Informatics as a joke. Then in 2014, computer scientist Peter Van Plu forwarded the exact same 2005 paper to the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology after receiving a whole series of unwanted emails from the journal. To Van Plu's surprise, he received a note saying that the paper had been reviewed, rated as excellent by the journal's peer review process, and accepted for publication. Wow. The paper was actually not published since he declined to pay the article processing fee. In 2013, a science journalist named John Bohannon submitted over 300 versions of a, quote, deeply flawed paper to open access journals. It was accepted by 60% of the journals.
Wow. 60%.
In April 2014, an Ottawa Citizen reporter wrote a completely plagiarized nonsense paper about soils, cancer, and Mars. He submitted the paper to 18 journals. Only 2 turned him down for plagiarism. So these are often called predatory journals, and they seem to try and prey on young, inexperienced researchers. They basically charge a fee suggesting they'll proofread, peer review, and edit a research paper, but they actually don't carry out that work. Jeffrey Beal, a librarian at the University of Colorado, Denver, has been posting a list of predatory publishers since 2011. In that first year, he listed 18 publishers. In 2012, that number rose to 23. In 2013, it was 225.
Oh, wow.
In 2014, it was 477. 2015, 693. And this year's list has 923 publishers. And then last week, a blog post from Christoph Bartnick from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand suggested that this stuff is also happening with conferences. He received an email inviting him to submit a paper to the International Conference on Atomic and Nuclear Physics taking place in the U.S. next month. Here's a quote from his blog post. Since I have practically no knowledge of nuclear physics, I resorted to iOS's autocomplete function to help me write the paper. I started a sentence with atomic or nuclear and then randomly hit the autocomplete suggestions. The text really does not make any sense. He then added the first illustration on nuclear physics from Wikipedia and plugged in some references. He submitted under the fake identity Iris Pear. Iris is Siri backwards. Pear is a play on Apple. Nice. He provided a fake university located at 11 Infinite Loop in Cupertino, California, Apple's headquarters, and the author's biography included a photo of Susan Bennett, an actor who is the voice of Siri. Here's an example of the paper, which is titled, Atomic Energy Will Have Been Made Available to Single Source. The atoms of a better universe will have the right for the same as you are the way we shall have to be a great place for a great time to enjoy the day you are a wonderful person to your great time to take the fun and take a great time and enjoy the great day you will be a wonderful time for your parents and kids.
Have you thought about running for president?
Right.
Fantastic.
So within 3 hours of submitting, Bartnick received an acceptance letter asking him to confirm his slot for an oral presentation by registering for the conference at a cost of just over $1,000.
Oh.
CNET contacted Andrea Afanasyev, a physicist at George Washington University, who's one of the names listed on the organizing committee for the conference. He said he recently became suspicious when no one asked him to screen applications or help with the program. He said, quote, there are real scientists listed on the program, but it looks like this conference is organized by non-experts and they have no screening of contributed talks. It doesn't look good at all, so I will be withdrawing from the event. As a final note, looking into the story, I was reminded of a really interesting episode of the Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine podcast hosted by a friend of the show, Ken Milton. On that October 2014 episode, Ken's guest was Dr. Jeremy Faust, and it was called Everything You Know Is Wrong. On it, they discussed the question, is the peer review process as we know it good for science and medicine? I'll put a link in the show notes to that episode if people are interested in checking it out. I highly recommend it.
It's important stuff, although very depressing, of just how much junk there is out there and how it's very hard for the person on the outside to discern what is value and what does not. especially given that I've been talking about problems with legitimate scientific journals and legitimate publications with supposedly respected researchers. And of course, I think there is a difference between, autocomplete junk that's submitted for a funding organization, we'll say, or other entities that are trying to do actual science. But we might also admit it's just on a continuum of absolutely terrible to much better, but it's all in there. And from the outside, it's very hard to tell. And I think as a scientist or someone who might want to publish, you have to be pretty on the ball then of what has value and what does not.
Oh, yeah.
I originally, back in 2014, when I heard that episode with Jeremy Faust, was thinking about doing a segment on TRC about it. And I actually contacted friends of the show, Chris Hassel and Chris Hebern, to talk about it. And that got so complicated so quickly that I just decided to sort of put it on the back burner and never got back to it. So there is this movement to go to open source journals that are kind of peer reviewed after the fact, but there's so much involved. And Chris Hassel pointed out the fact that it's not just peer review, but it's also funding. Like, it's a very complicated issue, this idea of moving towards like the internet for publishing stuff.
Yeah.
Canada is currently considering plain packaging for cigarettes. The goal is to reduce the appeal of tobacco products, particularly amongst young people. This plain and standardized packaging would lack distinctive or attractive features, would have all packages in having a similar appearance and shape, and they would basically have the same ordinary color and font. We recently got an email from listener Peter from Waterloo about this topic. It reads, I've been seeing recent Facebook posts showing up from both sides of the argument. And he gives a link to the bothsidesoftheargument.ca website. Not a great website.
Sorry. We don't always say it. That's the point. All right, everyone?
We only say it when the website's really great.
Yeah.
It appears to be both new and a single topic page regarding plain packaging of cigarettes, and he gives a link to an Ottawa Citizen article on the topic. Despite the name, the content appears to be largely against the issue. Perhaps you may want to investigate either who created the page, I suspect the tobacco lobby, or if plain packaging actually works at reducing tobacco consumption. Keep up the great work, avid checker Peter from Waterloo. Thank you for the message, Peter. Indeed, I get many ads from this page. Have you guys seen these ads on your feeds, Facebook feeds?
So they're running ads on AM radio here in Toronto.
Oh, wow. Okay. Makes sense.
So I've heard many of them. Yeah.
Maybe some. Not much comes to mind.
Okay. My feed is inundated with them. I get these ads multiple times a day. And it immediately became obvious to me that these people were not truly representing both sides of the argument. And also, they were only really talking about one argument. It isn't obvious from their propaganda ads, but it doesn't take much work to find out where the money comes from when you check out their site. Right at the top of their webpage, it states a JTI McDonald Corp initiative. Well, it seems kind of like a generic name if you're not really into the world of cigarettes. So who is that? JTI is Japan Tobacco International. Despite the name, Japan Tobacco International operates in some 120 countries, and their brands include Natural American Spirit, Winston, Mevius, Camel, Benson & Hedges, Silk Cut, Glamour, Sobranie, and LD. So they don't really seem to be representing both sides, as they claim. Articles on the JTI website match those found on the Both Sides of the Argument website and Facebook page. And this lobbying isn't restricted to Facebook. So, Pat, you mentioned you heard them on AM radio. A quick Google search I did for evidence plain packaging cigarettes turned up a number of results. And the second news article I saw was in the Toronto Sun, and it was a special to the Sun by Igor Zadja. The article is full of statistics arguing against plain packaging and is signed off by Igor Zadja, president and CEO of JTI McDonald Corp. I Googled Canada plain packaging. The top result is a Google ad for both sides of the argument.ca. Similar such ads showed up in a lot of the other search results I was doing while I was preparing this segment. So both sides of the argument and articles like this aren't unbiased. They are just sort of propaganda by the tobacco industry. And the claims they make are a real mixed bag, and I'll try to touch on a few of them. They claim that plain packaging will encourage counterfeiting, that it won't reduce smoking as it hasn't in Australia, and that it is the first in a slippery slope for the government, who will next be having plain packaging on fast food and soft drinks, and that since Canadians don't believe it will be effective, it won't. So I'll look at a few of these. The first one is that in Australia, illegal sales grew after they implemented plain packaging. The idea being that if plain packaging is introduced, it will be easier to counterfeit or replicate cigarette packaging. Australia implemented plain packaging for cigarettes in 2012, and so it's used as an example for its efficiency. The both sides of the argument ads frequently mention that there has been an increase in illegal cigarette sales by 21% in Australia following the implementation of plain packaging. I couldn't find a specific source for this often cited number. However, I could find references to some KPMG research funded by the tobacco industry, which showed an increase in illegal sales. I also found some criticisms of that methodology. For example, a source of data was discarded packages, which were taken from public garbage spaces, which might have had more discarded packages from tourists who would have cigarettes that would have come from outside of the country, which would be classified as something that seems illegal or seems to be counterfeit. That said, the Center for Behavioral Research in Cancer did a study in 2014 titled Use of Illicit Tobacco Following Introduction of Standardized Packaging of Tobacco Products in Australia, Results from a National Cross-Sectional Survey. They found, and I'm reading from their conclusion here, while unable to quantify the total extent of use of illicit manufactured cigarettes, in this large national survey, we found no evidence in Australia of increased use of two categories of manufactured cigarettes likely to be contraband, no increase in purchase from informal sellers, and no increased use of unbranded illicit chop tobacco. Beyond this, there was no evidence that plain packaging was easier to counterfeit. There had been almost no counterfeit plain packages found in Australia. There was only a single instance of counterfeit plain packaging cigarettes found by the Australian Customs and Border Protection Service.
I guess one interesting point about that, Adam, and I covered this a little bit when I first quit smoking, going on 3 years ago now, is even if there was an increase in counterfeit, which it seems that there's not in counterfeit cigarettes, one might question whether or not it's actually a result of this plain packaging or whether or not it's being driven more by the increase in cost. And I think that cigarettes in Australia are very expensive. Yeah,
so that it's always hard to see the data. So I saw a lot of the data about smoking rates, and they seem to decrease when cost goes up. That seems to just be a big factor all the time, right? And I guess counterfeiting would go the same way. Absolutely. So the next claim is that plain packaging didn't reduce smoking in Australia, and basically the point of plain packaging is to make cigarettes seem less appealing, but ultimately the idea is that would reduce smoking. Otherwise, what's it really doing? And there's a nice little graph that's shared by opponents of the proposed regulation that shows a steady decline in smoking in Australia, and that decline didn't increase more after the legislation started. So we accept that smoking has reduced since plain packaging was introduced, but not that it was reduced more than that trend that was already going on. So there is a graph that is used to show that there was a reduction in the rate of smoking after plain packaging was introduced, and this is used by the proponents of plain packaging. It's hard to explain this graph over the podcast, but there's disagreement of whether that is significant. You just kind of draw the line where you are. It's like, look, this is the line that this jumbled graph is following. No. My line is straight. Your line is crooked. My line is right, more than yours. Well, it's hard to say specifically. So opponents to the legislation suggest that the trend doesn't change, and that is a straight line representing a consistent decline in smoking prevalence over time in Australia. But it can plainly be seen from looking at the last few data points that after plain packaging legislation was introduced, all of those other points later all fall under the straight trend line that is supposed to be sort of going through the middle. It's not really as simple as opponents say, and maybe it's not an obvious decline like some of the proponents say, but this response isn't totally accurate either. Basically, smoking rates are decreasing in Australia, and how much is due to plain packaging is very hard to tell because there are so many factors that affect these fluctuating rates. It's really hard to calculate this kind of stuff. So next is the slippery slope argument. JTI says, tobacco style restrictions are increasingly being used as the model for regulation on a range of other product categories. This is a trend that is commonly known as the slippery slope. So they actually use the words slippery slope. Reasonable people don't often use these words. These are generally terrible and used by people to fearmonger and suggest something completely unintended will be the consequence of something else. Gay people can get married. What's next? People marrying horses? If you allow consenting adults to do whatever they want in the bedroom, next they'll be having sex with dogs. Teaching children to respect homosexuality and sexual education? What's next? Pedophilia? So this is often referred to as the slippery slope fallacy because the suggested events aren't always related. One does not simply ignore the distinction made between something reasonable and something ridiculous simply because they're on some awkwardly described continuum. The government is considering plain and standardized packaging for tobacco products. This is not a first step in their master plan to remove all packaging from everything in the economy in a gradual way. There are suggestions that some other products have different types of packaging or plainer packaging, but these aren't necessarily influenced by government's plain packaging cigarette initiatives. The province of Quebec, for example, has a prohibition against advertising to children under 13. This can be extended to logos or mascots that are considered too cute or too appealing to children. This was proposed in 1978, has been enforced since 1980, but this is something that I've seen referenced in some of these articles suggesting that it's taking the model of plain packaged cigarettes. These types of initiatives can and will be gauged on their own merits, and the decision to have plain packaging legislation on cigarettes won't mean similar legislation will start to be applied to all other manner of products. That's not really how government works. It's not really how people work. And the final claim I wanted to look at was that Canadians don't think plain packaging will work. Well, who cares if they don't think it will work? They ask a bunch of people that don't know anything about this topic, and then they ask them probably a very loaded question, and then they get the answer they expect. But this is government policy. It's not Family Feud. The truth is not determined by what the survey says. Plain product packaging is being considered for cigarettes in Canada. We will see where this goes. If Australia is an indication, it may reduce smoking, but it's hard to tell specifically with this one example and so many factors at play. The Both Sides of the Argument Facebook page is only presenting one side of the argument, and that is the one that is in the best interest of Japan Tobacco International. The claims included in their various ads are deceptive and often not evidence-based. These are people who don't mind if you die of lung cancer, as long as it makes them rich. I have made no effort of being nice to them in my responses to the ads I've seen. You're free to deal with them however you like. Facebook has an option for blocking ads that you consider offensive or that you disagree with. That might be a more reasonable way to go about it.
Well, Adam, I just want to say I'm shocked and surprised that notions of bad science would be associated with cigarettes. I just beside myself.
Yeah.
Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, Cuboids.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
A host/listener request. Pat, can you put in a survey says sounds?
Survey says. And that is the one that is in the best interest of
Chewbacca.
Of Japan Tobacco. Chewbacca. It's technically not being aired because it's going through like mostly ground wires, but someone's probably
you meant like that.
Someone's probably downloading through Wi-Fi.
For someone who's only on this podcast because they belong in the air.